She grabbed the glass of red wine and hurled it directly at his chest. Not an accident, not a stumble. The white woman looked that black man straight in the eyes and threw her drink all over his $3,000 suit. "That's what you get for sitting in first class," she hissed. But she didn't know she had just made the worst mistake of her entire life. Because the man she had just assaulted wasn't just any passenger. The wine hit Malcolm Reed's white Oxford shirt in a crimson arc that seemed to hang suspended in the air before gravity reasserted itself. The woman standing over him was breathing hard, her chest heaving beneath a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than his shirt, her manicured hand still gripping the empty wine glass like a weapon she wasn't finished wielding. Her face was flushed, eyes bright with something that looked less like anger and more like satisfaction. The expression of someone who'd been waiting for permission to do exactly what she'd just done and had finally granted it to herself. "Security!" Her voice cut through the cabin with the particular shrillness of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "This man doesn't belong here. He's been harassing me since boarding. Someone get him off this aircraft right now." The first-class cabin of Flight 2847 from Dallas-Fort Worth to Boston Logan had gone absolutely silent in the way that only happens when witnesses recognize they're watching something that will be retold, dissected, possibly recorded and shared across platforms they haven't even downloaded yet. 22 passengers frozen mid-conversation, mid-drink, mid-scroll, all eyes fixed on the tableau at the front of the cabin where a black man in his early 40s sat perfectly still while red wine dripped from his collar onto pants that had been pressed that morning, and a white woman in her 30s performed outrage like she'd rehearsed it. Malcolm carefully closed his laptop, the motion deliberate and unhurried despite the liquid now seeping into electronics that contained 3 months of work on the Harrington Maritime acquisition. He reached for the napkin on his tray table, dabbed at his shirt with the kind of precision that suggested he was documenting the stain rather than attempting to remove it, then looked up at the woman with an expression so calm it bordered on unsettling. "Ma'am, I haven't spoken to you since I boarded 20 minutes ago." His voice carried clearly through the cabin, measured and factual, the tone of someone narrating observable reality rather than defending himself. "I've been working on my computer in my assigned seat. You're the one standing in the aisle, having just thrown wine on me and my belongings." "Liar!" The word came out sharp enough to cut. "You've been staring at me, taking pictures, making me feel unsafe. I saw you with your phone out. I know exactly what you were doing." A flight attendant materialized from the galley, blonde and efficient-looking, her name tag identifying her as Brenda Klein. Her eyes moved between Malcolm and the woman, taking in the wine-soaked shirt and the empty glass and the 22 witnesses watching to see whose version of events she would validate through action or inaction. "What's happening here?" Brenda's question was directed at both of them theoretically, but her body language had already oriented toward the standing woman, the one whose distress was loudest, whose class and appearance aligned most closely with Brenda's own. "This man has been harassing me." The woman's voice had acquired a tremor that hadn't been present seconds earlier, fear or fury or performance art, impossible to distinguish. "I felt threatened. I reacted instinctively to protect myself. I need him removed from this flight immediately." Malcolm set the wine-stained napkin on his tray table with the same deliberate care he'd used to close his laptop. "Ms. Klein, I'd like to file a formal complaint about being assaulted by a passenger who then falsely accused me of harassment to justify the assault. I'll need incident report forms and I'll need to speak with the captain before this aircraft moves." Brenda's professional smile had frozen into something brittle. "Sir, let's not escalate this situation. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding without involving the captain or filing paperwork that could delay departure for all these passengers." "It's not a misunderstanding." Malcolm's correction was gentle but absolute. "It's assault, witnessed by 24 people, followed by false accusations designed to reframe the assault as self-defense. Those are facts, not interpretations, and they require documentation regardless of whether that's convenient for your departure schedule." 6 hours earlier, Celeste Harrington had stood in her Highland Park bathroom, applying the 3rd layer of mascara, While her phone buzzed with notifications, she was pretending not to monitor obsessively. Instagram engagement on her latest post about the charity gala was plateauing at numbers that felt humiliating compared to last year's performance. Her lifestyle blog, Curated Luxury, was hemorrhaging followers to newer influencers who somehow made opulence look effortless rather than desperate. She'd screenshot her banking app, not to share but to remind herself that the numbers were real, that the life she performed online was supported by actual wealth, that Evan's position as CEO of Harrington Maritime meant she belonged in spaces that made other people feel excluded. The pending acquisition would change everything. He'd promised over breakfast that morning before leaving for the office. Once the deal closed, once they'd absorbed their competitors' routes and contracts and market share, they would be untouchable in ways that made her current anxiety about social media metrics seem quaint. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Evan confirming her first-class ticket to Boston was booked, reminding her to pick up documents from his attorney that he needed signed before the board meeting tomorrow. She'd responded with a heart emoji and a selfie that had taken 17 attempts to capture the right balance of natural beauty and aspirational glamour, then spent 40 minutes selecting an outfit that telegraphed wealth without trying too hard to telegraph wealth. Now, standing in the aisle of Flight 2847 with an empty wine glass in her hand and Malcolm Reed's calm gaze fixed on her face, Celeste felt the performance solidifying into something she'd have to maintain regardless of whether she believed it herself. She'd thrown the wine in a moment of pure reactive fury, insulted by his presence in 1A when she'd expected that seat for herself, enraged by his refusal to be intimidated by her stares and sighs and pointed comments to Brenda about declining standards in premium cabins. But the moment the wine left the glass, the narrative had forked into two incompatible versions of reality, and she'd chosen hers with the instinct of someone who'd spent 34 years learning that the world would believe whatever story she told with sufficient conviction. Brenda had pulled out her tablet, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency that suggested she'd documented passenger conflicts before and developed protocols for managing them. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass and ID again. There seems to be some confusion about seat assignments." Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing both documents with movements so controlled they looked choreographed. "My boarding pass clearly shows seat 1A. My ID matches the name on the reservation. There's no confusion about seat assignments. What there is, however, is a passenger who assaulted me and is now attempting to have me removed from the flight through false accusations. He was in my seat." Celeste's interjection was sharp, her voice climbing to reach the passengers behind them who were now openly recording on their phones. "When I boarded, he was sitting in 1A, which is my usual seat. I always sit in 1A. The airline knows this. But apparently standards have slipped to the point where upgrades are just handed out randomly. You're in seat 2A. Brenda's correction was gentle, almost apologetic, as if she regretted having to contradict Celeste but facts required acknowledgement. "Your boarding pass shows 2A. The gentleman is correctly seated in 1A according to our manifest." "Then the manifest is wrong." Celeste delivered this with the absolute certainty of someone for whom reality was negotiable if you had sufficient status. "I've flown this route monthly for 3 years. I'm always in 1A. This is clearly a system error that resulted in someone being seated in my usual assignment." A man across the aisle in seat 2C, middle-aged with the rumpled appearance of someone who traveled too much to care about looking polished, cleared his throat loudly enough to draw attention. "Ma'am, you don't own seat 1A. The airline assigns seats based on availability and frequent flyer status. This gentleman was already seated when you boarded. I watched you see him, make a face, then deliberately take 2A while muttering complaints loud enough for everyone to hear." Celeste's head swiveled toward the speaker with predatory precision. "I don't recall asking for your input. This is between me and the crew regarding a passenger who made me feel unsafe. You made yourself unsafe by throwing wine at someone." The man's response was delivered with the flat certainty of someone stating observable facts. "I've got that part on video if the flight attendant needs corroboration for her incident report." Brenda's professional composure flickered, her eyes darting to the phone the man was holding up, then to the other passengers who were also recording, documentation accumulating in real time that would make certain versions of events impossible to maintain. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put your phone away. Recording crew members without permission violates airline policy." Actually, it doesn't. This correction came from a younger woman in seat 3B, probably late 20s, with the particular confidence of someone who'd researched their rights before exercising them. FAA regulations permit passengers to record in the cabin unless the crew can demonstrate specific safety concerns. Documenting an assault and the crew's response to that assault isn't a safety concern. It's evidence preservation. Malcolm had remained silent during these exchanges, his wine-stained shirt a visible accusation that required no verbal reinforcement. He'd pulled out his own phone now, opening what appeared to be a note-taking application, his thumbs moving across the screen with efficient precision. "What are you doing?" Celeste's question came out sharp with renewed anxiety. "Documenting." Malcolm didn't look up from his phone. Time of assault, 11:42 a.m. Location: Seat 1A, first-class cabin. Witnesses: approximately 22 passengers, one flight attendant. Nature of assault: wine thrown at my person and belongings, followed by false accusations of harassment when I requested formal complaint procedures. Estimated damage: laptop potentially ruined, shirt and pants require professional cleaning, psychological distress from being falsely accused of threatening behavior. His clinical recitation seemed to drain something essential from Celeste's performance. She'd been operating on the assumption that volume and emotion would overwhelm facts, that her distress would be taken as evidence of his guilt, that the social dynamics of the situation would default in her favor. But Malcolm's calm documentation, combined with multiple passengers recording and one willing to testify he'd witnessed the entire interaction, was creating a record that couldn't be gaslit away through strategic tears and accusations. "He's lying." Celeste's insistence had acquired a desperate edge. "He was staring at me, making me uncomfortable. I have the right to feel safe on this aircraft." "You have the right to feel safe." Malcolm's agreement was immediate and seemed to surprise her. "You don't have the right to assault people and then claim your feelings justify the assault. Those are separate things. Your discomfort, real or imagined, doesn't give you permission to throw wine at someone and ruin their belongings." Brenda had been typing on her tablet throughout this exchange, her expression suggesting she was composing a report she knew would be scrutinized by multiple departments within hours of landing. "I'm going to need to speak with the captain about how to proceed. This is beyond my authority to resolve independently." Finally, Celeste's satisfaction was premature and obvious. "The captain will understand that I was defending myself against harassment. The captain will review the witness statements and video evidence." The correction came from the man in 2C, who was now openly smiling in a way that suggested he was enjoying watching Celeste's narrative collapse. "Hard to claim self-defense when 24 people watched you throw wine at someone who was sitting quietly in his assigned seat doing work on his laptop." The cockpit door opened and Captain James Morrison emerged, a man in his late 50s with the weathered calm of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating both literal and metaphorical turbulence. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, taking in Malcolm's wine-stained clothing, Celeste's defensive posture, Brenda's anxious hovering, and the constellation of phones documenting everything. "Ms. Klein briefed me on the situation via intercom." His voice carried the particular authority of someone whose word was literally law at 35,000 feet, though they were still parked at the gate. "I'm going to need statements from both passengers involved and from any witnesses who observed what transpired." "Captain, this man has been harassing me since boarding." Celeste had pivoted immediately to addressing the highest authority present, her voice acquiring the breathy vulnerability of someone who expected protective instincts to override evidence. "I felt threatened. I reacted to protect myself. Now he's trying to make me seem like the aggressor when I'm the victim here." Morrison's expression remained neutral as he turned to Malcolm. "Sir, what's your account of what occurred?" "I boarded approximately 25 minutes ago and took my assigned seat in 1A. I've been working on my laptop since then. I haven't spoken to or interacted with any other passenger." At 11:42, the woman in seat 2A stood up, approached my seat, and threw wine at me while shouting for security and claiming I'd been harassing her. When I requested to file a formal complaint about the assault, she escalated her accusations. Morrison's attention shifted to the passengers holding phones. "I understand several of you have recordings of the incident. I'm going to need to review those before making any determinations about how we proceed." The man in 2C stepped into the aisle, holding up his phone with the confidence of someone who knew his documentation was damning. "Captain, I'm David Chun, attorney from Boston. I started recording when I heard the passenger in 2A making loud comments about declining standards and people not belonging in first class. I have footage showing her standing up, approaching seat 1A unprovoked, and throwing wine at this gentleman while he was typing on his laptop. He never looked at her, never spoke to her, never made any gesture that could be construed as threatening or harassing." Morrison took the offered phone, his face carefully neutral as he watched the footage that apparently confirmed everything Malcolm had stated. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from neutral to something harder, more judicial. "Ma'am, based on this evidence and the witness statements I'm hearing, you committed assault against a fellow passenger. That's a federal offense when it occurs on an aircraft." "I was defending myself." Celeste's voice climbed higher, desperation bleeding through the performance. "He was staring at me, making me uncomfortable. Just because he wasn't physically touching me doesn't mean he wasn't harassing me. Ma'am, feeling uncomfortable isn't legal justification for assault." Morrison's response was measured but firm. "And based on this footage, the gentleman wasn't even looking at you. He was focused on his computer. Your claim of harassment appears to be fabricated to justify an unprovoked attack." A woman in seat 4A spoke up, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone used to being heard. "Captain, I'm Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, psychiatrist from Dallas. I've been observing this interaction with clinical attention." The passenger in 2A displayed escalating agitation from the moment she boarded and saw someone she apparently felt didn't belong in seat 1A. Her comments to the flight attendant about upgrades and declining standards were coded racial hostility. The assault was the culmination of that hostility, not a defensive reaction to any behavior from the victim. Before we continue, let me ask you a question. How many times have you seen injustice happen in real life and told yourself it wasn't your problem? David Chun recorded. Dr. Okonkwo spoke up. Justin published. What did the other 19 do? If the story already has you hooked, please hit that like button, because engagement is what makes these stories reach people who need to see them. Subscribe because injustice doesn't stop when you close this video. Celeste's face flushed darker, anger and humiliation mixing in equal measure. "How dare you psychoanalyze me? You don't know anything about me or my motivations. I know what I observed." Dr. Okonkwo's calm was implacable. "I know the pattern of behavior that preceded the assault. And I know that falsely accusing someone of harassment after assaulting them is a recognized tactic for avoiding accountability." Morrison held up one hand, forestalling further debate. "Here's what's going to happen. Ms. Harrington, you're being removed from this flight. Airport police are being called to document the assault and determine whether criminal charges will be filed. Mr. Reed, you have the option of continuing on this flight or rebooking on a later departure if you prefer not to travel after this incident. I'd like to continue on this flight once the situation is resolved." Malcolm's response was immediate. "I have meetings in Boston tomorrow morning that I can't reschedule. But I will be filing a formal complaint with the airline and I'll be providing a statement to police about the assault." Absolutely unacceptable. Celeste's outrage had reached a pitch that suggested genuine disbelief at the turn of events. "Do you know who my husband is? Evan Harrington, CEO of Harrington Maritime. One phone call and your career. Ma'am, threatening airline personnel is another federal offense. Morrison's interruption was sharp. I strongly suggest you stop talking and wait for police to arrive. I boarded approximately 25 minutes ago and took my assigned seat in 1A. I've been working on my laptop since then. I haven't spoken to or interacted with any other passenger. At 11:42, the woman in seat 2A stood up, approached my seat, and threw wine at me while shouting for security and claiming I'd been harassing her. When I requested to file a formal complaint about the assault, she escalated her accusations. Morrison's attention shifted to the passengers holding phones. I understand several of you have recordings of the incident. I'm going to need to review those before making any determinations about how we proceed. The man in 2C stepped into the aisle, holding up his phone with the confidence of someone who knew his documentation was damning. Captain, I'm David Chun, attorney from Boston. I started recording when I heard the passenger in 2A making loud comments about declining standards and people not belonging in first class. I have footage showing her standing up, approaching seat 1A unprovoked, and throwing wine at this gentleman while he was typing on his laptop. He never looked at her, never spoke to her, never made any gesture that could be construed as threatening or harassing. Morrison took the offered phone, his face carefully neutral as he watched the footage that apparently confirmed everything Malcolm had stated. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from neutral to something harder, more judicial. Ma'am, based on this evidence and the witness statements I'm hearing, you committed assault against a fellow passenger. That's a federal offense when it occurs on an aircraft. I was defending myself. Celeste's voice climbed higher, desperation bleeding through the performance. He was staring at me, making me uncomfortable. Just because he wasn't physically touching me doesn't mean he wasn't harassing me. Ma'am, feeling uncomfortable isn't legal justification for assault. Morrison's response was measured but firm. And based on this footage, the gentleman wasn't even looking at you. He was focused on his computer. Your claim of harassment appears to be fabricated to justify an unprovoked attack. A woman in seat 4A spoke up, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone used to being heard. Captain, I'm Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, psychiatrist from Dallas. I've been observing this interaction with clinical attention. The passenger in 2A displayed escalating agitation from the moment she boarded and saw someone she apparently felt didn't belong in seat 1A. Her comments to the flight attendant about upgrades and declining standards were coded racial hostility. The assault was the culmination of that hostility, not a defensive reaction to any behavior from the victim. Before we continue, let me ask you a question. How many times have you seen injustice happen in real life and told yourself it wasn't your problem? David Chun recorded. Dr. Okonkwo spoke up. Justin published. What did the other 19 do? If the story already has you hooked, please hit that like button, because engagement is what makes these stories reach people who need to see them. Subscribe because injustice doesn't stop when you close this video. Celeste's face flushed darker, anger and humiliation mixing in equal measure. How dare you psychoanalyze me? You don't know anything about me or my motivations. I know what I observed. Dr. Okonkwo's calm was implacable. I know the pattern of behavior that preceded the assault. And I know that falsely accusing someone of harassment after assaulting them is a recognized tactic for avoiding accountability. Morrison held up one hand, forestalling further debate. Here's what's going to happen. Ms. Harrington, you're being removed from this flight. Airport police are being called to document the assault and determine whether criminal charges will be filed. Mr. Reed, you have the option of continuing on this flight or rebooking on a later departure if you prefer not to travel after this incident. I'd like to continue on this flight once the situation is resolved. Malcolm's response was immediate. I have meetings in Boston tomorrow morning that I can't reschedule. But I will be filing a formal complaint with the airline, and I'll be providing a statement to police about the assault. Absolutely unacceptable. Celeste's outrage had reached a pitch that suggested genuine disbelief at the turn of events. Do you know who my husband is? Evan Harrington, CEO of Harrington Maritime. One phone call and your career. Ma'am, threatening airline personnel is another federal offense. Morrison's interruption was sharp. I strongly suggest you stop talking and wait for police to arrive. Ms. Harrington is banned from this flight and will likely face a permanent ban from the airline pending the outcome of the investigation. Morrison pulled out a business card, handing it to Malcolm. This has the contact information for our customer relations department and our legal team. They'll work with you regarding compensation for damaged property and any other impacts from this incident. Brenda had been hovering nearby, her earlier deference to Celeste apparently transformed into anxiety about her own role in the situation. Mr. Reed, I want to apologize for not intervening more quickly. When Ms. Harrington first made comments about seating, I should have shut down that line of conversation immediately instead of engaging with her complaints. Malcolm studied her for a moment, his expression suggesting he was weighing whether to be gracious or honest. He chose something in between. You should have. The moment she started making comments about people not belonging in first class, you had an obligation to address that rather than validating her perspective through your attention. Your hesitation gave her permission to escalate. Brenda flinched at the assessment but nodded. You're right. I'll be including that in my own statement about what occurred. David Chun had moved to the empty seat beside Malcolm, his attorney instincts apparently compelling him to offer unsolicited counsel. Mr. Reed, I practice civil rights law in Boston. What happened to you today constitutes both assault and discrimination. If you're interested in pursuing this beyond the airline's internal processes, I'd be happy to discuss your options. I appreciate the offer. Malcolm's response was polite but non-committal. Right now, I just want to get to Boston and handle the meetings I flew here for. But I'll keep your contact information in case I decide to pursue legal action. The young passenger from 3C who'd recorded Celeste's initial comments approached next, his phone still in hand. Sir, I'm posting this to social media unless you'd prefer I didn't. I think people need to see what happened, but I also don't want to violate your privacy if you'd rather handle this quietly. Malcolm considered the question with visible care. What's your name? Justin Torres. I'm a journalism student at BU. I've been documenting airline discrimination for a project about how public spaces enforce invisible hierarchies. Then document this. Malcolm's permission was clear and deliberate, but include context that this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern that happens to people who don't look like they belong in premium spaces according to someone's prejudiced assumptions. The assault was dramatic, but the casual racism that preceded it is the real story. Justin nodded, his fingers already moving across his phone screen. I'll frame it that way. Thank you for trusting me with the narrative. The flight departed 47 minutes late. Malcolm's wine-stained shirt, a visible reminder of what had transpired even after Brenda had brought him a clean blanket to cover the damage. The passengers who'd witnessed the incident kept glancing at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to the particular discomfort of people who'd watched injustice unfold and were still processing their own reactions to it. Dr. Okonkwo moved to the aisle seat beside him once the seatbelt sign turned off, her voice low enough that their conversation remained private. How are you holding up? That was a significant assault, both physical and psychological. You handled it with remarkable composure, but that doesn't mean it wasn't traumatic. I'm used to it. Malcolm's response was matter-of-fact rather than bitter. Not the wine-throwing specifically, but the underlying assumption that I don't belong in spaces like this. The suspicion, the barely concealed hostility. Today was just more explicit than usual. That's precisely why it's traumatic. Dr. Okonkwo's clinical assessment was delivered with warmth. The fact that you've developed coping mechanisms for racist hostility doesn't mean you should have to keep using them. You shouldn't have to be used to this. Malcolm was quiet for a moment, staring at the laptop bag at his feet that contained electronics he suspected were beyond repair. The woman who assaulted me mentioned her husband, Evan Harrington, CEO of Harrington Maritime. She seemed to think that connection would protect her from consequences. Did you recognize the name? Dr. Okonkwo asked. I did. Malcolm's smile was slight and didn't reach his eyes, which makes this situation more complicated than she realizes. He didn't elaborate, and Dr. Okonkwo didn't press, though her expression suggested she recognized there were layers to this situation that hadn't yet surfaced. The flight continued smoothly, the captain making no announcement about the delayed departure or the incident that had caused it, allowing the passengers who hadn't witnessed the confrontation to remain blissfully unaware that someone had been removed for assault. Malcolm worked from his phone for the remainder of the flight, composing emails that referenced meetings and documents and timelines that suggested his trip to Boston involved significant professional stakes. He declined the meal service when Brenda offered it with excessive apologies, accepting only water and the space to think through implications that were apparently complex enough to require careful consideration. Justin's social media post went viral somewhere over Pennsylvania. Malcolm's phone started buzzing with notifications from people he hadn't heard from in months, messages asking if he was okay, if the video they were seeing was really him, if he needed anything. He turned off notifications and returned to his work, his expression suggesting he was compartmentalizing the assault into a problem to be dealt with later, rather than allowing it to derail his immediate priorities. When the plane landed at Logan, Captain Morrison made an unusual announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, before we deplane, I want to address an incident that occurred prior to departure. A passenger was removed from this flight for assaulting a fellow traveler. The victim of that assault handled the situation with grace and dignity that I deeply respect. I want every passenger on this aircraft to understand that discrimination and violence have no place in aviation, and anyone who engages in such behavior will face immediate and serious consequences. The cabin was silent for a beat before several passengers began applauding. Malcolm looked up from his phone, startled by the response, then nodded once in acknowledgement before gathering his belongings. He was among the first to deplane, moving through the jetway with purposeful strides that suggested he was already mentally ahead of himself, focused on whatever awaited him in Boston rather than dwelling on what had happened in Dallas. Airport police were waiting at the gate, not for Malcolm but to take his statement about the assault. He spent 20 minutes in a small office recounting the incident with the same clinical precision he'd used when documenting it on his phone, his voice betraying no emotion as he described wine hitting his shirt, Celeste's accusations, the witnesses who'd corroborated his account. The officers took photographs of his stained clothing, photocopied his boarding pass and ID, and assured him they'd be in contact once they'd completed their investigation. Will she face charges? Malcolm's question was direct. The younger officer, a man in his 30s who'd been taking notes throughout the interview, looked up with an expression that mixed sympathy and realism. That depends on several factors. The district attorney will review the evidence and determine whether to prosecute. Assault on an aircraft is federal, so it would go through U.S. Attorney's Office. With video evidence and multiple witnesses, there's definitely a case. But whether they choose to pursue it. He trailed off with a shrug that suggested bureaucratic priorities were often mysterious. Malcolm nodded as if he'd expected that answer. I'll be providing a victim impact statement if charges are filed, and I'll be pursuing civil action regardless of whether criminal prosecution moves forward. He left the airport and took a car service to his hotel in the financial district, a boutique property that suggested expense account travel rather than budget consciousness. In his room, he finally allowed himself to examine the full extent of the damage. His laptop was likely ruined, wine having seeped into components that would corrode and fail even if it appeared to function initially. His shirt and pants were stained beyond salvaging despite being custom-tailored pieces he'd owned for years. But more than the material damage, he felt the residual adrenaline of the confrontation, the particular exhaustion that came from having to maintain perfect composure while being assaulted and falsely accused. He showered, changed into fresh clothes, and checked his phone to find 63 messages and 14 missed calls. Most were from colleagues who'd seen Justin's viral video, expressing outrage and support in equal measure. 3 were from partners at his firm wanting to discuss the incident and its potential implications. And 1 was from a number he didn't recognize, a voicemail that made him smile for the first time since wine had hit his shirt. "Mr. Reed, this is Detective Patricia Morales with Boston PD. I'm calling because your assault case has been flagged for priority review due to the high-profile nature of the incident and the alleged perpetrator's threats regarding her husband's influence. The U.S. Attorney's Office has already reached out to coordinate. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Malcolm returned the call, spending another 20 minutes walking Detective Morales through the incident and answering questions about Celeste's specific statements regarding her husband's resources and attorneys. When Morales asked if he knew who Evan Harrington was, Malcolm's response was careful. "I'm familiar with Harrington Maritime. They're a shipping logistics company based in Dallas. Moderate size, regional presence, family-owned for 3 generations." The alleged perpetrator seemed to believe her husband's position would insulate her from consequences. Morales's tone suggested she found this assumption personally offensive. People with wealth often operate under that belief until reality corrects them. Malcolm's observation was delivered without judgment, simply stating a pattern he'd apparently witnessed before. The question is whether the system will actually deliver those consequences or whether her assumptions will be validated. "Mr. Reed, can I ask what brings you to Boston? Is this trip personal or professional?" "Professional. I'm attending meetings tomorrow regarding a corporate acquisition my firm is handling." There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that suggested Morales was connecting dots she hadn't previously realized formed a pattern. "What firm do you work for, if you don't mind me asking?" "Reed and Halvorson LLP. I'm a managing partner." Another pause, longer this time. "The Reed in Reed and Halvorson. You're one of the top mergers and acquisitions attorneys in the country." "That's the reputation we've built, yes." "And you're in Boston for an acquisition. Would that acquisition happen to involve maritime logistics companies?" Malcolm's smile was audible in his voice. "I can't discuss details of pending deals, Detective. Client confidentiality." "Of course." Morales sounded like she was smiling too. "Mr. Reed, I have a feeling this case is going to resolve itself in ways that don't require much intervention from law enforcement. But for what it's worth, I'll make sure the assault charges move forward, regardless of any attempts at interference from well-connected families." Malcolm ended the call and pulled up his email, scrolling through messages from colleagues who were waiting for his arrival at tomorrow's meetings. The Harrington Maritime acquisition had been in negotiation for 8 months, a complex deal that would merge Evan Harrington's regional shipping company with a larger national competitor. Malcolm's firm represented the acquiring company, and he'd been the lead attorney structuring the transaction, navigating regulatory requirements, conducting due diligence on Harrington's financials and operations. The deal was scheduled to close in 3 weeks, pending final board approval from both companies. Malcolm had flown to Boston because the acquiring company's headquarters were here, because the final negotiation sessions required his presence, because millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs hung on details that still needed resolution. And Celeste Harrington had just assaulted the attorney whose recommendation would determine whether the acquisition moved forward or collapsed. Malcolm pulled up a draft email he'd been composing to his senior partner, Michael Halvorson, regarding concerns he'd identified during due diligence. The email outlined several red flags in Harrington Maritime's operations: questionable labor practices, potential environmental violations at their port facilities, accounting irregularities that suggested profit manipulation. Nothing definitively illegal, but enough concerning patterns that Malcolm had been debating whether to recommend additional investigation before closing. He added a new paragraph to the email, clinical and factual, describing the assault on the aircraft and Celeste Harrington's specific statements about her husband's influence and resources. He noted that she'd threatened his career, implied that Harrington Maritime's attorneys would destroy him, and suggested that he had no idea who he was dealing with. Then he attached Justin Torres's viral video, the footage that showed wine hitting his shirt while he sat working peacefully. Celeste's voice shrill with manufactured fear, the witnesses who documented her escalating hostility. He added links to 3 more videos that had surfaced from other passengers, each one corroborating the same sequence of events from different angles. His conclusion was measured but damning. Given the behavioral patterns demonstrated by Mrs. Harrington and her explicit threats involving company resources for personal retaliation, I recommend we conduct additional due diligence into Harrington Maritime's corporate culture and governance structure. The assault itself is a personal matter I'll handle through appropriate legal channels. However, Mrs. Harrington's assumption that her husband's position entitled her to assault someone without consequences, and her threats to weaponize company attorneys against a private individual, raised serious questions about ethical boundaries within the organization. He read the email 3 times, ensuring the language was professional and defensible, that his personal experience of being assaulted didn't overshadow the legitimate business concerns he was raising. Then he hit send and watched it disappear into the digital void that would deliver it to Michael within seconds. His phone rang almost immediately. "Malcolm, I just watched the video." Michael Halvorson's voice carried the tightly controlled fury of someone who'd spent 40 years in corporate law and had seen every variety of human behavior but could still be shocked by its ugliest expressions. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? Legal support?" "I'm fine, Michael." Shaken, but unharmed beyond some ruined clothing and electronics. "Airport police took my statement. The U.S. Attorney's Office is apparently fast-tracking the assault investigation due to the perpetrator's threats about her husband's influence." "Good. Let them bury her." Michael's vindictiveness was uncharacteristic but apparently sincere. "I've already forwarded your email to our entire partnership team and to the board of directors at Coastal Freight Solutions. They need to see this before tomorrow's negotiation session." Coastal Freight Solutions was the acquiring company, the national logistics firm that had been courting Harrington Maritime for nearly a year, seeing the acquisition as an opportunity to expand their Gulf Coast presence and absorb valuable port contracts. Malcolm had spent months structuring the deal, navigating Evan Harrington's ego and his insistence on maintaining family legacy while extracting maximum value from the sale. "Michael, I want to be clear that my recommendation for additional due diligence is based on legitimate business concerns, not personal retaliation for being assaulted by the CEO's wife." "Malcolm, you're the most ethical attorney I've ever worked with, which is why I know your recommendation isn't about revenge. But let me be equally clear. Even if it were about revenge, I'd support it. That woman assaulted you, falsely accused you of harassment, and threatened to weaponize her husband's corporate resources against you personally. That behavior reflects on Harrington Maritime's governance, whether she holds an official position or not." Malcolm heard papers rustling on Michael's end of the call. "I'm looking at the due diligence report you flagged last month about labor violations at their Port Arthur facility. Remind me what we found." "Systematic wage theft, primarily affecting immigrant workers who were unlikely to report violations. Off-the-books overtime, misclassified contractors, safety equipment charges deducted from paychecks in violation of OSHA regulations. The amounts were relatively small per worker but added up to significant profit padding when multiplied across their workforce." "And Evan Harrington's response when you raised these concerns?" "He dismissed them as standard industry practice and suggested that our client was being naive about how shipping logistics actually operated. He became defensive when I pressed for documentation, implied that excessive regulatory compliance would make the acquisition less attractive financially." Michael was quiet for a moment, the silence suggesting he was making connections between Evan's dismissive arrogance about labor violations and Celeste's assumption that assault wouldn't carry consequences. "I'm calling an emergency partner meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Before we sit down with Harrington Maritime, we need to decide whether Reed and Halvorson wants our name attached to this acquisition. Michael, Coastal Freight has been our client for 12 years. Walking away from this deal will damage that relationship. They've invested significant resources in the acquisition based on our recommendation. They've invested resources based on incomplete information. Your assault and the perpetrator's connection to the target company constitute material new information that changes our risk assessment. We have an obligation to inform Coastal Freight that the family controlling Harrington Maritime has demonstrated concerning ethical boundaries. Malcolm felt something unclench in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since wine hit his shirt, the fear that his assault would be minimized or ignored because it was inconvenient for business interests. Thank you for taking this seriously. Malcolm, you're not just a colleague. You're a partner. Your family. Someone hurt you and threatened you. That's not something we ignore just because it complicates a deal. Michael's voice softened slightly. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be intense. The call ended and Malcolm sat in his hotel room watching the Boston skyline darken as evening settled over the city. His phone continued buzzing with notifications as Justin's video spread across platforms, accumulating millions of views, generating commentary from civil rights organizations and legal analysts and ordinary people who were outraged by what they'd witnessed. Somewhere in Dallas, Celeste Harrington was presumably dealing with the consequences of assault charges and viral infamy. Her perfectly curated life imploding in ways she'd never anticipated when she'd thrown wine at a man she'd assumed was powerless. Malcolm wondered if she told her husband yet. If Evan knew that his wife had assaulted the attorney whose blessing was required for their acquisition to close. If either of them had connected the dots between her victim and their pending financial salvation. His phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Mr. Reed, this is Evan Harrington. I need to speak with you urgently regarding an incident involving my wife. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Malcolm stared at the message for a long moment, considering whether to respond immediately or make Harrington wait, whether this conversation should happen over phone or in person, whether he should have his own attorney present or handle it directly. He decided on a middle path, responding with professional brevity. Mr. Harrington, I'm aware you're attempting to contact me. Given the circumstances, any communication between us should be routed through appropriate legal channels. My attorneys will be in touch. The response came within seconds, desperation bleeding through the corporate formality. Please, I understand my wife made a terrible mistake. I'm asking for the opportunity to make this right before it destroys everything we've built. Malcolm typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on one that was honest without being cruel. Your wife didn't make a mistake. She committed assault and attempted to use your professional position to threaten the victim of that assault. Those were choices, not mistakes. The consequences of those choices are now unfolding according to legal and professional processes that neither you nor I can control. His phone rang immediately. Evan Harrington's number displayed on the screen. Malcolm declined the call. It rang again. He declined again. The third time he answered, his voice carefully neutral. Mr. Harrington, I asked that communication go through legal channels. Mr. Reed, please. I'm begging you. Celeste told me what happened on the flight. She's devastated. She knows she acted inappropriately. She's willing to apologize, to make full restitution for any damages, to do whatever is necessary to resolve this situation. Is she willing to admit she assaulted me without justification? To acknowledge her accusations of harassment were fabricated? To accept criminal charges without using your resources to avoid accountability? Malcolm's questions were delivered without hostility, simply clarifying what actual accountability would require. Evan's pause was long enough to answer the question before he spoke. We both know that criminal charges would be devastating for her, for our family. I'm asking you, as one professional to another, to show some compassion, to consider that people make mistakes in moments of stress and fear. Mr. Harrington, your wife wasn't stressed or afraid. She was angry that I was sitting in a seat she felt belonged to her. She escalated that anger into assault and false accusations. That's not a stress response. That's entitlement meeting consequences. I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But destroying Celeste's life, destroying my company, destroying the livelihoods of 300 employees who had nothing to do with this incident, that's disproportionate. That's vindictive. Evan's voice had shifted from pleading to something sharper. The entitlement his wife had displayed beginning to surface in his own tone. Mr. Harrington, I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply allowing the natural consequences of your wife's actions to unfold. She assaulted me. That's a crime with legal ramifications. She threatened to weaponize your corporate resources against me. That raises questions about your company's governance that my firm has an obligation to examine before recommending our client proceed with an acquisition. You're using your position to retaliate against my wife's mistake. The accusation came out flat, certain, as if Evan had convinced himself this was the only possible explanation for what was happening. I'm using my position to protect my client from acquiring a company whose leadership demonstrates questionable ethical judgment. Your wife's behavior is a symptom of a culture that apparently believes wealth and connections override legal and moral boundaries. That's exactly the kind of risk factor we're paid to identify during due diligence. This is blackmail. Evan's voice had gone cold. You're leveraging a personal incident to derail a business transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Here is a quick question for you, the viewer. Do you know that this story only exists because Malcolm refused to make it go away quietly? Because witnesses refused to delete their footage? Because you're watching right now and making it impossible to bury? Your view matters. Your share matters. Or the next Celeste just settles quietly and does it again. Subscribe if you believe documentation dismantles power. Or don't, and wonder why nothing ever changes. This is due diligence. Malcolm's correction was immediate. And if you're threatening me right now, please be aware that this call is being recorded and will be added to the documentation my firm is compiling regarding concerns about Harrington Maritime's governance. The line went silent for several seconds before Evan spoke again, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was recalibrating his approach. Mr. Reed, I apologize. That was inappropriate. I'm under significant stress and I spoke without thinking. Please, can we meet in person to discuss this situation like rational adults? I have meetings all day tomorrow with your acquisition partner. If those meetings result in a decision to move forward with additional due diligence, I'm sure our firms will arrange appropriate discussions. But I won't be meeting with you privately to negotiate how your wife's assault should be handled. That's not a business matter. That's a criminal matter being handled by law enforcement. The video is everywhere. Evan's statement carried the hollow quality of someone still processing a reality they hadn't fully accepted. Celeste's face, her voice. People have identified her. Identified me. Our business is being flooded with calls from reporters. Our social media is being destroyed by people calling her racist, calling me complicit, demanding boycotts of our company. Then I suggest you focus on managing that crisis rather than trying to convince the victim of your wife's assault to make it go away quietly. Malcolm kept his voice even, refusing to take satisfaction in Evan's obvious distress despite the temptation. Good night, Mr. Harrington. I'll see you tomorrow at the negotiation table. He ended the call before Evan could respond, then immediately called Detective Morales to report the conversation and send her the recording. She listened to the entire exchange without interrupting, her occasional sharp intakes of breath suggesting she was making notes about statements that could be construed as witness intimidation or attempted obstruction. Mr. Reed, I'm documenting this as an attempt to interfere with a criminal investigation. If Harrington contacts you again, don't answer. Direct him to contact your attorney. Any further communication could strengthen charges against both him and his wife. Malcolm agreed and ended the call, feeling the accumulated stress of the day finally catching up to him. He ordered room service, ate mechanically while reviewing documents for tomorrow's meetings, then attempted to sleep despite his mind cycling through scenarios and implications and the surreal reality that he'd started the day as a passenger on a routine flight and ended it at the center of a viral incident that was reshaping both his personal life and a multimillion-dollar acquisition. The partner meeting the next morning began at 8 a.m. in a conference room at Reed and Halvorson's Boston office. The space filled with 7 attorneys who'd reviewed the videos and read Malcolm's email and arrived with expressions ranging from fury to calculation. Michael Halvorson chaired the meeting with the efficiency of someone who'd already made his decision and was simply ensuring everyone else reached the same conclusion. We have 3 options. Michael's summary was characteristically blunt. 1. We ignore the assault and Malcolm's concerns about governance, proceed with the acquisition as planned, and hope nothing blows back on our reputation. 2. We recommend Coastal Freight pause the acquisition pending additional due diligence into Harrington Maritime's culture and practices. 3. We recommend Coastal Freight walk away entirely. Jennifer Park, the firm's youngest partner, spoke first. Option 1 is ethically indefensible and exposes us to massive liability if other problems surface post-acquisition. We'd be ignoring red flags we documented. That's negligence. Option 3 costs us a major client and millions in fees. This came from Robert Chen, the partner who managed the firm's financial operations. Coastal Freight has invested 18 months and significant resources in this acquisition based on our recommendation. Walking away damages that relationship potentially beyond repair. Option 2 gives us cover while allowing the deal to potentially proceed if additional diligence comes back clean. Michael's tone suggested he'd already landed on this approach. We inform Coastal Freight that new information has emerged requiring deeper investigation. We expand our review of Harrington Maritime's labor practices, environmental compliance, and corporate governance. We let the facts determine whether the acquisition is advisable. Malcolm had remained silent during these exchanges, recognizing that his assault made him personally invested in ways that could cloud his professional judgment. But Jennifer looked directly at him now, her question direct. Malcolm, setting aside the assault for a moment, did your existing due diligence uncover enough concerns that you would have recommended additional investigation even without this incident? Yes. His answer was immediate and certain. The labor violations, the environmental issues, Evan Harrington's dismissive attitude toward regulatory compliance. Those were all flags I documented before his wife threw wine at me. The assault simply provided additional context about the family's relationship with accountability and consequences. Then we're not retaliating. Jennifer's conclusion was firm. We're doing our job. The assault is additional evidence supporting concerns we'd already identified through legitimate due diligence. Evan Harrington can claim we're being vindictive, but our documentation will show a pattern of problems that predated any personal conflict. The partnership voted unanimously for Option 2, additional due diligence with recommendation to pause the acquisition timeline. Michael scheduled a meeting with Coastal Freight's board for 10 a.m., giving them 2 hours to prepare a presentation that would explain the new concerns without making Malcolm's assault the centerpiece of their recommendation. At 10 a.m. precisely, Malcolm walked into another conference room, this one occupied by 5 board members from Coastal Freight Solutions who'd flown in from around the country for what they'd expected to be final negotiation sessions. Their expressions suggested they'd seen the viral video and understood that this meeting would not proceed as planned. Susan Martinez, Coastal Freight's CEO, spoke first. Malcolm, before we discuss business, I want to say that what happened to you was horrific and unacceptable. Please know that you have our complete support in whatever legal action you pursue. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. Malcolm's gratitude was genuine but brief, already pivoting to professional mode. I know you've all reviewed the email I sent last night. What I want to emphasize is that my concerns about Harrington Maritime existed before the assault. The incident simply highlighted governance issues we'd already documented. He pulled up a presentation on the conference room screen, walking them through months of due diligence findings with clinical precision. Labor violations at Port Arthur. Environmental citations at their New Orleans facility. accounting irregularities that suggested aggressive interpretation of revenue recognition standards. Evan Harrington's resistance to compliance improvements. What the assault demonstrated, Malcolm continued, his voice steady despite discussing his own victimization in front of 5 executives, is a family culture that believes rules apply differently to people with wealth and influence. Celeste Harrington assaulted me and then threatened that her husband's resources would destroy my career. Evan Harrington called me last night attempting to negotiate away criminal charges and characterizing our due diligence as vindictive retaliation rather than legitimate risk assessment. That pattern of entitlement and resistance to accountability is consistent with what we've observed in their business practices. David Werner, Coastal Freight's CFO, leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose instinct for financial risk had just been activated. Are you recommending we walk away from the acquisition entirely? I'm recommending we pause and conduct a deeper investigation into corporate culture, governance structures, and compliance history. If that investigation reveals the problems are isolated and addressable, the acquisition could potentially proceed with appropriate safeguards and warranties. If it reveals systematic issues, then yes, I'd recommend walking away regardless of the sunk costs. Susan exchanged glances with her board members, silent communication passing between them. How long would this additional diligence take? 60 to 90 days to do it thoroughly. We'd need to interview current and former employees, review additional financial records, conduct site visits to all facilities, examine the full history of regulatory interactions. Malcolm pulled up a preliminary scope document his team had prepared overnight. It's extensive, but given the size of this acquisition and the red flags we've identified, it's necessary. And Harrington Maritime's response to this delay? This question came from Patricia Okonkwo, the board member responsible for risk management. No relation to Dr. Okonkwo from the flight, but sharing the same sharp assessment capabilities. Evan Harrington will likely characterize it as retaliation for his wife's assault. He'll claim we're using our position to punish him personally rather than conducting legitimate business review. Malcolm's prediction was delivered with certainty born from Evan's phone call last night. He may threaten legal action, claim tortious interference with the acquisition. He may attempt to negotiate directly with your board to circumvent our recommendations. Let him try. Susan's voice carried steel. Reed and Halvorsen has represented Coastal Freight for over a decade. Your integrity and judgment have never been questioned. If you're recommending additional diligence, we trust that recommendation regardless of how Harrington chooses to spin it. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, the board ultimately voting to authorize the expanded investigation and formally notify Harrington Maritime that the acquisition timeline was being extended pending completion of additional review. Malcolm left the conference room feeling the weight of what he'd just set in motion. The professional consequences that would ripple out from Celeste's decision to throw wine at a man she'd assumed was powerless. News of the delayed acquisition leaked within hours, financial reporters connecting the dots between the viral assault video and the sudden pause in a deal that had been considered nearly finalized. Stock analysts began questioning Harrington Maritime's viability, their coverage highlighting the labor violations and environmental citations that Malcolm's due diligence had uncovered. Business publications ran think pieces about corporate governance and family-owned companies that operated with insufficient oversight. Celeste was formally charged with assault 3 days later, the U.S. Attorney's Office filing federal charges based on the incident occurring on an aircraft. Her attorney immediately began negotiating a plea agreement, but prosecutors had little incentive to offer favorable terms given the overwhelming video evidence and her viral infamy, making her an unsympathetic defendant. The DA's office announced they were also investigating potential witness intimidation charges related to Evan's phone call to Malcolm. Harrington Maritime's employees began coming forward with stories about workplace culture. Anonymous interviews describing an environment where the Harrington family's preferences overrode policy and law. Former workers documented wage theft, safety violations, retaliatory terminations for anyone who questioned company practices. The pattern Malcolm had identified through financial records became a narrative of systematic exploitation that made headlines across shipping industry publications. Now, let me ask you this. How many more companies right now are getting away with the same exploitation because nobody with a platform cares enough to look? This video has millions of views. Their labor violation story got thousands. That imbalance is exactly why injustice continues. Subscribe and share if you believe workers' stories matter as much as viral drama. Or don't, and prove that people only care when it's entertaining. Evan Harrington resigned as CEO 6 weeks after the assault, the company's board apparently concluding that his association with both his wife's criminal behavior and the emerging labor violations made him a liability they couldn't afford. The acquisition talks with Coastal Freight collapsed entirely when expanded due diligence uncovered evidence of environmental contamination at their facilities that would require tens of millions in remediation costs. Celeste ultimately pleaded guilty to assault charges and received 26 months in federal prison, her attorney's attempts to negotiate probation failing in the face of her viral notoriety and unrepentant initial response to the crime. The judge's sentencing statement specifically referenced her attempts to weaponize her husband's position and resources to avoid accountability, noting that such behavior demonstrated exactly why incarceration rather than community service was appropriate. Malcolm never returned to Dallas. He settled the civil lawsuit against Celeste for an undisclosed sum that he immediately donated to organizations supporting airline workers facing passenger harassment. He declined most interview requests, giving a single statement to Justin Torres for a long-form article about discrimination in premium travel spaces that won a student journalism award. 6 months after the assault, Malcolm received a letter at his office, forwarded through multiple legal channels to ensure no direct contact occurred. The return address was a federal correctional facility in Ohio, the handwriting on the envelope shaky and uncertain. He opened it to find 2 pages of Celeste Harrington's desperate attempt at apology. Words that tried to explain her behavior through stress and fear and assumptions she was only now recognizing as racist. She described mandatory classes on bias and privilege that she was taking as part of her incarceration, therapy sessions where she was supposedly confronting the entitlement that had shaped her worldview, a nascent understanding that her wealth had insulated her from consequences until it hadn't. The letter asked for nothing except forgiveness, though even that request was hedged with acknowledgement that Malcolm owed her nothing, that she had forfeited any right to his compassion when she threw wine and lied. She wrote about working in the prison's sanitation services, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors, experiencing the kind of labor she'd benefited from but never acknowledged when others performed it invisibly. Malcolm read the letter twice, then filed it with the other documentation from the incident. He didn't respond. Forgiveness felt premature, possibly Yongjeo Bukernungda. But he recognized that Celeste's incarceration had forced confrontations with reality that freedom had allowed her to avoid. Whether those confrontations would produce lasting change or simply taught her to perform contrition convincingly remained to be seen. On a cold December morning nearly a year after the assault, Malcolm boarded a flight from Boston to San Francisco for a different acquisition, a different client, a different set of negotiations that would determine whether companies merged or remained separate. He presented his first-class boarding pass at the gate without incident, found his assigned seat without anyone questioning whether he belonged there, worked on his laptop while flight attendants brought him water and snacks without making him feel like he was receiving charity rather than service he'd purchased. The flight was uneventful in ways that felt like small miracles to people who'd been assaulted for existing in premium spaces. Malcolm landed safely, attended his meetings, successfully closed the deal he'd flown west to finalize. Life continued forward because it had no choice, momentum carrying him beyond the incident that had briefly made him viral, beyond the moment when wine hit his shirt and a woman's entitlement collided with consequences. But he carried the memory with him, not as trauma that paralyzed but as evidence that systems could be disrupted when victims refused to disappear quietly, when witnesses documented rather than looked away, when professional obligations to truth overrode financial incentives to ignore red flags. Change wasn't guaranteed. Justice wasn't automatic. But sometimes, occasionally, The universe aligned in ways that held powerful people accountable for the casual cruelty they'd assumed was their right. Celeste Harrington would serve her 26 months and eventually return to a world that had moved on without her. Her social media following evaporated, her marriage dissolved, her wealth significantly diminished by legal fees and the collapsed acquisition that had been her family's financial salvation. She would work minimum-wage jobs that taught her the value of labor she'd previously dismissed, would experience the indignities of existing in a world without the buffer of resources that had previously protected her from consequences. Whether she emerged rehabilitated or simply bitter remained an open question that Malcolm didn't need answered. He'd gotten justice in the ways that mattered most: legal accountability, professional validation, systemic exposure of the company that had enabled generations of entitled behavior. The rest was Celeste's burden to carry, her transformation or lack thereof ultimately irrelevant to Malcolm's ability to move forward with his life and his work. On a flight that was peaceful and professional and utterly mundane, Malcolm Reed closed his laptop and allowed himself to notice the absence of hostility, the luxury of existing in a space without having to defend his right to be there. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't closure. It was simply the ordinary dignity that everyone deserved but that too many people had to fight for every single day. And sometimes, just sometimes, that fight produced enough consequences that the next person didn't have to wage it quite as hard. That was enough. That had to be enough. That was the only kind of justice that ever really lasted.